To Laura Kuenssberg.
There are big promises on migration, but big questions about the government's approach. And this morning, we have some big stars for you to get ready. The Prime Minister's been on his travels, trying to talk tough on migration.
I've been having a series of very productive discussions here to strengthen everyone's support for Ukraine, but also to work cooperatively to tackle illegal migration, which is one of my 5 big priorities.
And the numbers of people moving here overall is going up and up and up. Labour's accused the Conservatives of failing, and there's been a critic closer to home. The former Prime Minister caught up over whether to publish his COVID phone messages. The government's refusing to publish everything and taking its own inquiry to court.
Just to be clear, you're saying the government's going to court, but it thinks it's going to lose.
No, it's going to court to test.
But you think you're going to lose?
No, I'm saying, I think personally, it's quite likely that the courts will rule that Baroness Hallett will decide what evidence.
That was a government minister. The Prime Minister will need firmer support to keep his big promise. So our main question this morning, is the government getting to grips with migration at all? It's Robert Jenrick's job to sort that out. The Immigration Minister is here. Business says they need more people, but Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Johnny Reynolds, will be with us too. What could turn everything upside down? Another conflict. We'll hear from Taiwan's Foreign Minister on the threat from China, perhaps to us all. And whether you know him as Rev, Quentin from White Lotus or Corky from The Night Manager, you'll certainly recognise this famous face. Tom Hollander with his fellow actor Will Keane on stage on Putin and Russia's billionaires. And with me, the real-life Logan Roy. Actor Brian Cox is back after the huge success of the drama Succession. Rain Newton-Smith, the boss of the CBI, battling to save it. And Salma Shah, Tory insider and former advisor at the Home Office. Good morning to you. Promises. The Conservatives have made some huge ones in the past on immigration, and they simply have not all been kept. Before we talk about that, let's show you what's going on the front pages. There's no one story dominating today, but on the front page of The Sun, they look ahead to Holly Willoughby's return to the TV sofa tomorrow after all that drama. The Mirror suggests anti-Holly, claiming the BBC is trying to poach her. Who knows about that? The Sunday Times does feature one of our talking points today, what's going on at the CBI, suggesting the former boss, Tony Danker, is going to sue. And our main conversation, migration, is on the front of the Sunday Telegraph, suggesting that asylum seekers are to be ordered to share a room. We'll talk to the Immigration Minister about that in a couple of minutes' time, but welcome to all of you. Brian, you speak your mind, like Logan Roy. You've previously been outspoken on this government's approach to immigration. Why?
Well, I think that immigration has been a problem that's... we are suffering from things that we've done in the past. And that's why we have the immigration problem that we have. You know, the desettlement of the Middle East and what's culminately happened over the years. And I think that we are finally reaping what we sow. And I think that's the real root of the problem. And unfortunately, you're going to get these gangs who are going to exploit that and exploit it for the worse. And you also have people who are genuinely trying to escape from something which is pretty horrific. And the world, as the great Irish playwright Sean O'Casey said, is in a terrible state of chassis chaos. And I think it is actually as a result of that chaos that we have the problem with immigration. Of course, this government has not been able to deal with it. It should have been able to deal with it. But it's very difficult for any government, quite frankly, to deal with it.
Limits to what they can do.
Absolutely.
And Sam, in the last couple of days, I've talked to 5 former Home Secretaries, actually, who've all made that point. They said there are things that we can do, but the global forces are so huge. But on the things that the government can control, it does look like a mess. Why?
I think the difficulty here is that the politics of the debate around immigration is not nuanced, and it doesn't reflect the reality of what immigration actually is. You know, Brian's just talked about the global forces. That is a big impact. Then there's the process of who's actually coming, why are they coming, and why are they using these routes, which the government can have some control over, some, not a lot. And then also, for the politics of it, there is the toxicity around the debate of the consequences of migration. So there are questions about changing communities, about strain on public services and things like that. All of them are legitimate, and there's not a single policy that's going to be able to capture and correct everything that's going wrong in that process.
It's interesting there that you said it's not nuanced enough. I mean, you were an advisor to Sajid Javid when he was at the Home Office, but do you think politicians have more responsibility to try to explain that nuance to people watching this morning?
Yeah, absolutely I do. And I think there's been, you know, it's decades long, this issue around migration. People have used it, all political parties, by the way, have used it to create, you know, wins. And making it about numbers, I think, has been a real tragedy. And I'm sure Rain is going to talk about this at some point. That nuance between economic migration and cultural migration, that's never been properly explored or explained.
Well, Rain, there is something a bit strange going on, isn't there? Because the government says we've got to bring the numbers down, we want to bring the numbers down. But actually, the numbers are going way up because the economy demands it.
Yeah, and look, I think, as Salma was saying, and we really need to distinguish between migration, economic migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. And I think the problem is in the public discourse, and when politicians talk about it, it all gets mixed up. And I think when I talk to businesses, what they say is they really need people to help grow their businesses. They're trying to create jobs and they can't find people to do the innovation that they want. And if we think about it, you know, work visas, 38% of those are for health and social care. We need people. We've seen over the past few years how important health and the health of our workers is to our economy. And on the other hand, we also see we need to have safe and legal routes where people who are coming here to seek refuge and our asylum seekers can have an avenue. And one of the things I think is also really important is when you are waiting for your status to determine whether you are a refugee or not, you should be allowed to work and contribute to our society. And that's something that businesses, and we've also said, is really important.
OK, well, maybe we'll get to that with the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, in a couple of minutes. More from these three later. And a spoiler alert for you, we will be talking about the Succession finale. So if you haven't seen it, bear that in mind. But our main business, of course, is those promises on immigration. Are you fed up with the promises to cut it that don't seem to work? Or fed up that no one is making the positive case for people coming to the UK? We'll talk to the Minister in charge in a sec, but first, let's remind ourselves of some of the facts on illegal immigration.
Stop these boats now.
Turn back the boats.
It's time to tackle the small boats.
Stop the boats.
But how's that going? Well, in 2020, around 8,500 people crossed the channel in small boats. But in 2022, it was more than 5 times that, more than 45,000. And the asylum claims they make are taking longer than ever to get sorted out. Look back to 2010, there were about 7,000 people stuck in the system. But now it's 172,000 instead. Well, Robert Jenrick is here as promised. And to be really clear, we're going to start by talking about asylum seekers, and then later we'll talk about the overall numbers of people who are coming here legally. Now, as Rain Newton-Smith just said, when asylum seekers are here, they are not allowed to work, and therefore the taxpayer supports putting them up and looking after them. I want to show our viewers an image they might not have seen, and I'd like you to explain what's going on here.
Well, I think you're showing photos of a hotel in Pimlico where some migrants were asked to be housed. These are people who had come to the country, had claimed destitution, saying that they had no funds, they didn't have family or friends that they could live with, and therefore we, the government, are under a legal duty to support them. And so the government offered them to stay in this hotel, and some initially declined, saying that they didn't want to share hotel rooms, as I understand it. But I think we asked them to share rooms to save money for the taxpayer, and because anyone who is genuinely destitute would, I think, accept that offer, and I believe almost all of the migrants in question did.
Well, in the end, what happened was they were asked to share 4 to a room. They actually barricaded themselves outside the hotel, caused disruption for people living in that area, and you can see for them it probably wasn't very pleasant, and for people in that posh part of London, it wasn't very pleasant. And the Home Office actually left 40 men to sleep outside on a London street for 2 nights.
No, that's not actually right, Laura. As I understand what happened here, was that these migrants who had themselves said that they were destitute, they had nowhere to stay, we had offered them a safe bed with board and lodgings in a good quality hotel in central London. Yes, some of them had to share with other people. These are single adult males. I don't think that's unreasonable. We want to reduce the cost to the taxpayer. Some people said that wasn't good enough and they wanted their own ensuite bedrooms. And the Home Office took the perfectly reasonable view that we've got to look after the taxpayer here. And if you're genuinely destitute, of course you'd accept that. And common sense prevailed, and I think almost all of the migrants in question accepted the accommodation.
But is it now the government's policy at 395 hotels around the country that are currently housing asylum seekers in situations like this, is it now your policy to tell people they have to share 4 to a room?
No, that's not right. But what we are saying is that we want to reduce dependence on hotels. We don't want to be using hotels at all. These are taking away valuable assets for the local business community, for society. You know, people's weddings and personal events have had to be cancelled because of that. But where we are using them, it's right that we get good value for money for the taxpayer.
But I'm confused,
and so if
because
single adult males can share a room, and it's legal to do so, which will obviously depend on the size of the accommodation, then we'll ask people to do that. And I think that's a completely fair and reasonable approach.
But in this
the long-term answer, if I might say, is not to debate the symptom of the problem, but it's to reduce the number of people coming across the channel in the first place. And that's our primary focus.
But the symptom of the problem is real for those people, and it's very real for communities right around the country. And in this case, you asked them to share 4 to a room, they refused, and in the end they were allowed to share 2 to a room. And so that's the specifics of this case.
Well, I'm not sure that is actually correct.
Well,
Laura,
but the broader point here is people are really worried about what's going on, whether they look at that and think we're asking people to live in inhumane conditions, or whether they're in a community.
Inhumane conditions.
We're talking about the broader.
I will never put the interests of migrants above those of the British public. That's my duty as immigration minister. And of course we'll treat people legally and decently at all times. But I also have got to reduce reliance on hotels, because that's taking away valuable assets from our country and costing billions of pounds.
But this is a real point of concern for people right now. And our viewers have also been in touch about this. Ilana in Dorset, where there's to be a barge housing, I think, 500 migrants, wants to know how you can justify that with no consultation to the local community. Another viewer in that part of the world has said there are real safety concerns about putting a large group of single men suddenly into a community. And you wouldn't have this expensive problem if the system to get these people's claims sorted out was working. And the system is certainly not working. It's taking longer and longer to sort these claims out. There are 175,000 cases in the backlog. How have you allowed that to happen?
Well, firstly, I do think all these new forms of accommodation are the right approach, because we can't be reliant on hotels. We've got to use things like barges or disused army bases. We also can't allow the UK to be perceived to be a soft touch. And I've just spent the last week visiting European countries like France and Italy and those further upstream in North Africa. And all European countries are grappling with the same challenge. How do you accommodate very large numbers of mostly economic migrants? How do you deal with their cases in an efficient manner?
But you are not, that is the point, you're not dealing with them in an efficient manner.
The Prime Minister, Home Secretary and I put in place a plan at the end of last year, and that's already bearing fruit. We're doubling the number of caseworkers, we're stripping out some of the unnecessary bureaucracy and streamlining the system, but the asylum system is riddled with abuse. We have to be honest with ourselves.
And you've been in charge of it for 13 years.
My job is to be honest with the public, and the way to tackle that is by changing fundamentally the way we handle asylum. And that's what we're doing with our illegal migration bill. That's got an entirely different premise to the old system. It's saying that if you come here illegally, for example on a small boat, you will be here for days or weeks in detained accommodation. You'll then be returned home, if it's safe to do so, to a European country, for example, like Albania, or to a safe third country like Rwanda, that will create the deterrent we desperately need. It will break the business model of the people smuggling gangs, and it will stop the system from coming under intolerable pressure like it is today.
And that's what you hope will happen, but there is not concrete evidence that is what will happen. We talked about it at some length with the Home Secretary a few weeks ago, but there is deep scepticism that your scheme to send people to Rwanda will suddenly make this problem go away.
Well, you say deep scepticism, but actually this has worked in Australia, the one country in which it's been tried. And I can assure you, having spoken to counterparts across Europe in the last 5 days, there is interest in what we're doing. All European countries are grappling with a European, in fact, a global migration challenge. I've just been in North Africa where there are tens of thousands of people who are waiting to make the crossing from countries like Libya and Tunisia. This is a massive European challenge. We are taking very robust steps, and I think we have probably the most comprehensive plan of any of the major European countries, and we're already delivering.
And you have a plan, and we'll see if it works, but our viewers know, we've talked about it a lot, there are big question marks about whether or not it will work. We will see. Let's talk about then the different aspect of what is going on with immigration. Now, it feels like a long time ago, it is some time ago since the Conservative promised to get net migration down to the tens of thousands. The latest figure I want to show people this morning was actually a record level of more than 600,000 people who came and settled the UK. Net migration, the difference between people who are arriving and leaving. Now, is it remotely realistic to think you're ever going to get it down to 100,000?
Well, we've said, and the Prime Minister reiterated this during the week, that we want to see net migration come down. Net migration is far too high today, and for a number of important reasons. Firstly, it is placing serious pressure on housing, on public services, and our ability to successfully integrate people into the country. And secondly, because we want businesses to be, in the first instance, investing in British workers and in technology and automation that drives productivity, not just reaching for the easy lever of foreign labour.
Is it realistic to think you might ever get it under 100,000?
Well, I don't think that targets like that are particularly helpful, because migration is an extremely challenging space where behaviours are constantly changing. The key thing that we've done in recent years, which distinguishes us from previous governments and Home Secretaries who've made these promises, is that by leaving the European Union, by taking back control, we have the levers now at our disposal to make these changes.
And that's exactly the point, is you have used these levers, and what has happened, for good or for ill, is that net migration has gone up and up and up. Our viewers are well aware of this.
Let me give you an example
let me ask you one of our
one of the
viewers'
changes we've
questions.
made.
We've got an important question for our viewers. John says, please ask about the Conservative encouragement of immigration students. The increase in students is far greater than the number coming by boats. The focus seems confused. Now, he's right, isn't he? Because on the one hand, you're going to sit here and say, well, I want immigration to come down. But actually, for good or for ill, because of the needs of the economy, you've let in many more students, you're bringing in many more seasonal workers. The list of so-called shortage occupations of people who the economy needs is getting longer and longer and longer. It is confused, isn't it?
No. Firstly, I think it's right to completely distinguish between legal and illegal migration. We're taking amongst the most robust action of any European country to stop the small boats and to tackle illegal migration, because it shouldn't be for people smugglers to determine who comes into this country.
It's
for the government and Parliament. On legal migration, as a result of the points-based system that this government created, we now have the ability to show some flexibility where there are skill shortages. But as I say, that has its limits, because there is a responsibility on business and industry to invest in the workforce, and it gives us, for the very first time, the ability to change things when we need to.
And the reality is that has meant
let me
that
give you an example of what we have just done.
up.
Let me give you an example of what we've just done. We've taken serious action to tackle the dependence of students. There's over 100,000 dependents of those students who are coming to the UK for short courses, like masters, who are in the UK, placing pressure on housing and public services. And we've made a change last month to say that you won't be able to bring those dependents into the country anymore. That is the kind of tangible change that we are now able to make,
and that might not
and which will make a material difference.
Nobody who's following us thinks that will have a very significant impact on the numbers, but
well,
at the very least...
I think it will have a tangible difference, actually. But can I just say on the broader question of numbers...
On this broader question, at the very least, isn't it baffling for people watching this morning who've heard Conservative ministers say immigration's far too high, we have to bring it down, and then see the reality of the decisions you've made for the economy, for good or ill, is that immigration is going up and up and up. That is a contradiction,
I've been clear that I do want it to come down. That's very important to me and to the Prime Minister. That's why we made the manifesto pledge and we've restated it. There are some exceptional factors that we should all acknowledge. The generosity of the British public in offering one of the world's greatest resettlement schemes for Ukrainians, the Hong Kong scheme to tackle creeping authoritarianism in Hong Kong, the schemes we've had for Syria and Afghanistan, and the global scheme that we have run by the United Nations, they've accounted for a very large amount of exceptional migration to the country in recent years. And I think that commands broad support of the British public. But we as a government are committed to bringing the number down, which is in stark contrast to Labour, incidentally, because only the other day you had the chair.
That they want immigration to come down, and we'll be talking
the chair of the Labour
later in the
the chair of the Labour Party
said that
she expects net migration to rise in the short term.
We'll be talking to Labour later in the programme. Finally, I just want to ask you, we've been in touch with the families of those who lost loved ones during the COVID pandemic, who've told us that it is obscene that the government is taking its own inquiry to court to block the publication or the handover of ministers' WhatsApp messages. Should ministers just hand over everything? This court case is a farce, isn't it?
Well, let me be clear. We will hand over to the inquiry absolutely anything that is related to COVID or the purpose of the inquiry, and that's the right thing to do. We want to support the inquiry. We established the inquiry, and we've already handed over more than 55,000 documents. The point of difference is a simple one, which is that we don't see why you would hand over documents that have absolutely nothing to do with COVID. I'm a former lawyer. I've been involved in many discovery requests from courts in the past, and the way they usually work is that you set reasonable parameters, you hand over things that are related to the case or the inquiry, but there's no precedent, as far as I can see, to hand over things that have got absolutely nothing to do with COVID, such as things to do with civil servants' private lives.
Well, we will see
That's
what
the
happens
distinction,
in that court case.
I hope that we can resolve that
ahead.
with the inquiry, and it doesn't need to go to court.
We'll see what happens. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick,
thank you.
Thanks very much. Great to have you with us this morning. Well, let us know what you think. Did Mr Jenrick's answers convince you? What are your experiences in your own community? As ever, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk or the hashtag #BBCLauraK is where you can share your views, and we'll try and share some of that conversation a bit later in the show. And of course, you can go to the BBC Live page as well. Now then, last week we showed you quite a surreal interview, a performance perhaps, with the Russian ambassador in the UK talking about what's going on in Moscow. But how Vladimir Putin ended up in charge is the drama being played out on stage in London's West End every night. The actor, Will Keane, is booed every night for his eerie performance as Putin. And Tom Hollander, a very familiar face from stage and screen, plays the character Boris Berezovsky, the real-life billionaire who helped propel Putin to the Kremlin and then turned against him. Take a look.
In the West, you have no idea. You think of Russia as a cold, bleak place, full of hardship and cruelty. We are here today to urge the West to open its eyes and see that this Russia will never be a good neighbor. It will threaten the world order. It will be an enemy of freedom, and we must act now.
Why do you think Peter Morgan chose to call this patriots? You know, it's such a strong word. Why do you think he went for that title?
One of the principal things that he's looking at is different definitions of patriotism and different definitions of looking at a country at a time when it was in unbelievable flux and trying to decide what kind of country it was going to become.
They were all patriots. Putin is sincere, is a moralist. Berezovsky in his own way is a moralist. So was Litvinenko. All these characters who we learn about all thought they're all fighting over the soul of Russia, and they all felt they were doing the right thing, and therein lies the tragedy.
Peter Morgan wrote this long before the invasion of Ukraine, long before Russia was sort of back in all of our faces, if you like, as a kind of subject of concern. Does that change how you've gone about playing this role? You know, if you'd had this script a few years ago before Ukraine and thought about it, would you approach it in a different way to how you've approached it this time?
What has changed is that now that we're at war, I'm more cautious about opening any post that arrives at the theatre from Russia.
Really? What do you worry might happen? That's interesting.
Well, we're at war, aren't we? So, and we're now quite visibly doing a play which is, broadly speaking, anti-Putin, and so we're. I go, oh, probably won't open that.
So do you feel that you might have made yourself a target by taking this up?
No, I just think it's a little bit more serious than it would have been before the war. That's all. We're not doing a sweet Chekhov play. We're doing something that's about living figures who are embattled with the West. So that's just a reason for not opening everything that arrives in the post.
Tell us about Berezovsky and about playing him. You know, this man who, as he reminds Putin in the play, says, "I created you." Tell us about him.
Well, Berezovsky was one of the original group of oligarchs that understood what the possibilities of capitalism might be. The vast majority of Russians weren't so up to speed, and he was very interested in democracy and freedom of speech and ideas that we've all taken for granted in the West, and he wanted to promote them. The forces, the old communist forces, the KGB forces, which were still very active and obviously produced Putin, hated him. And Berezovsky, who was very competitive, didn't want to toe the line in the way that, say, Abramovich did. Berezovsky went to war with the man that he thought, he considered should be grateful to him for having got him the job as president. And the play, in a way, is like a morality tale about somebody going to war with the devil and losing.
And how does it feel, actually, you know, night after night, being booed by the audience, and not in a pantomime way?
It does feel like, I would say, we are engaging with the audience in a very particular way, that it's not the same as doing a play which has nothing to do, it doesn't impinge at all on people's sort of day-to-day news reading or whatever. So it does have it is exciting to feel that you, like I say, that you're engaging with their minds in a way that is sort of very present. If that means a few boos, that's a good thing.
Many of our viewers, though, know you for so much of your TV work, and Rev, the Night Manager, and of course recently White Lotus. Now, White Lotus 3 is being very eagerly anticipated. Now, unless there's going to be some sort of Bobby Ewing coming out of the shower moment, you are not going to be in season 3.
No.
Definitely, there's not going to be some kind of comeback. Quentin is really dead.
I don't think so, no.
Well, is it about series like that, and maybe also Succession at the moment, with this huge level of luxury and opulence, and people are just sucking those kinds of things up? Why?
Yeah, perverse, isn't it? It's probably, people are fascinated by people that they hate, aren't they? And also we are in a potentially sort of revolutionary moment in which some people have become so obscenely wealthy that the rest of the world can only gawp at them, and if the White Lotus gives you a chance to laugh at them and it's horror. What?
And watch them suffer.
And watch them suffer. Exactly.
Watch them all be killed off at the end.
Yeah, it's sort of horror fascination, isn't it?
It's one of the interesting things that's happening in America is the writer's strike. I just wonder if you, as also somebody who has written as well as performed, do you have a view on that? Should the big business just cough up for writers properly?
Writers are the most important people. They're the primary creators, and without them, there's nothing. And they need to fight for their corner. And if AI is about to replace everyone's script writing lives, then they need to hold their ground. What is fascinating about it to me is that it's the way that the unions have real power in America, which we consider to be land of the free market, and the sort of Thatcherite aspiration was partly a kind of American aspiration, but actually the irony is in America the unions have a real block power, which we no longer have here. So I kind of think, go for it.
Tom and Will, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Patriots is on in London's West End until the 19th of August. Brian Cox, you heard there Tom Hollander saying that the writers on strike in America should go for it. Is he right?
Absolutely. Of course they should. I mean, they are the, as he said very clearly, they're the prime forces of what we do. You know, we can't do anything without the writers. And I've been particularly lucky to work with a genius like Jesse Armstrong and Lucy Prebble and Tony Roach and Georgia Pritchett, these amazing writers who created our show. And they should get their just rewards for it. And unfortunately, producers are the ones who behave rather badly.
Really?
Oh yes, all the time. You know, they're the ones who kind of sort of are the manipulators, and sometimes the writers get pushed to the tap end of the bath. And I think it's time that the writers actually, I mean, they have done it before in the past, but it's time that they really asserted their rights, because they are the main focus. That's what you like. When you see a show like Succession or a show like White Lotus, it's the writers, it's the writing, it's they're the ones who have done it. And you have to go with that.
What you also see, as those two were talking about there, is right now this opulence, these luxurious lifetimes. And they basically said that people love to watch people they hate. Do you think people hated
that's what the whole success of our show is about, is everybody loves to hate. And these are extremely hateful people. And we've seen what happens to these hateful people and how, you know, I gather, I haven't seen the end of the show, but I gather the finale is, my character has been proven right, because he knew this was all going to happen. Then, of course, fate interfered and he dies. But in the end of the day, he was right.
Well, we're having a big spoiler alert. We will be talking about the finale a bit later. But there, you heard it here first. Brian Cox has not seen the finale of Succession. I watched it for the first time last night, and we will talk to you about it in our own finale at the end of the show. But Salma, let's talk about what Robert Jenrick had to say on migration. Now, if you were his special advisor, what would you be WhatsApping to him after that interview? What would you be saying?
I think as far as the government is concerned, he's sort of did a good job. He ticked all the right boxes as far as the messaging goes. I think there's something interesting about what he said, you know, about the practicalities in protecting taxpayer funding. You know, actually, the Home Office is on an incredibly tight budget, and there are practicalities involved with being able to house migrants. And I think, you know, he alluded to it. There's a generosity that has occurred because of people coming in from Hong Kong, Ukraine and Afghanistan, and that does ultimately put pressure on the system. So what you have is the Home Office sort of, you know, the practicalities of delivering the policy against the rhetoric that politicians tend to use, and that's butting against each other.
And communities are seeing in their own towns, villages around the country, that actually the idea that this is under control, the idea that this is getting down, people are seeing that this is not the case, for good or ill. They're seeing it unfold in a way that doesn't match what government ministers say.
Exactly, and I wonder if actually, you know, the answer is not to concede, but actually say, you know, as Ren was talking about earlier, should we be allowing people to work, and should we take the pressure off the system and, you know, basically move people into the community and society in a much more manageable way? But these are very big questions, and, you know, what seems to be happening, as it always does with immigration policy, is that people are actually being reactive to what's right in front of them instead of taking the broader perspective.
4 to a room, is that something that we should have, Brian?
I think it's very hard to have the broader perspective, quite frankly, because of the nature of the individual cases, the individual group. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of that. I mean, I think that Brexit has a lot to do with that. I think that COVID has certainly got a lot to do with what's happened. And I mean, I always think, it always amuses me, why do they want to come to this country? But when you look at it, it's almost the last stop on the map before you go further west. And I think that this country has represented certain things, but of course you get the criminal element who are exploiting it And that's why I think we have such a huge amount. I'd also like to talk about the student thing, because the student thing is very different in Scotland than it is down here. We depend on students and international students. I was the rector of Dundee University for several years. So I know how important that was, and how important it was to include these extraordinary talented people to come to and study here.
Well, that was one of the things I was going to ask you about, Rain. I mean, actually, someone said to me, lots of people think actually take them out of the numbers. But how important do you think that students' contribution and education as a sector is in terms of the economy?
It's hugely important, and that's something I think we need to appreciate, is students come here to study and they also leave. So that is part of, they're in the net migration numbers. And I think we've seen higher education, right, is one of our most important exports. It's critical to our economy, and it's also really important, not just in terms of what students bring when they're here and studying. They take back those learnings, they experience our culture, and then they are our ambassadors around the world. And I think we undervalue sometimes just the contribution that universities make to our whole innovation ecosystems around the country. We're really lucky in the UK that we have leading universities in every region in the UK, and we need to really protect them and appreciate what they contribute to our economy.
Well, we know there's been a bit of a standoff between the Home Office and other parts of government about whether or not you can cut those student numbers, but it looks for now that the Treasury sort of won out. Rain, I want to talk to you about the CBI. So if people haven't been following it, the organisation's been in a lot of trouble. The former boss, who might now sue the organisation, departed after allegations of inappropriate behaviour. There have even been allegations of rape at some CBI events. You've spent much of your career at the CBI. What was it like for you finding out about what went on?
Look, it's been absolutely devastating to read about some of these instances. And I think, you know, I hope we are emerging from what has been a really deep and painful crisis for us as an organisation. And I came back as a female leader to lead the organisation, because I really believe in the people. We have, you know, over 250 really talented economists, policy specialists, campaigners who are really brilliant at what they do. And I've seen how we've been able to help businesses and help government design effective economic policies to support jobs during the pandemic, to help us tackle some of the really big issues in our society around climate change. So, but that only works when we have the right cultures embedded within our organisation and the trust of our members, our staff, and of course the politicians.
So how are you going to sort it out? I mean, I've read your prospectus. I know there's a crunch vote this Tuesday when you're trying to ask your members if they still have confidence in the organisation, but it has been such a mess. Do you think the organisation deserves to survive?
I absolutely do, because I've seen just how effective we are when we have a collective voice of business across sectors and regions talking about the really big issues in our society around refugees, around immigration, around climate change, and what we do practically. What are some of the practical solutions we can do to solve some of those issues? And if you have individual businesses speaking on their own, you lose some of that. These things have to be solved through partnership, through collaboration. And the CBI, when we're effective, we can speak for the farming community, we can speak for technology, we can speak for businesses of all shapes and sizes across regions. So it's really important we have that collective voice.
But there are other business groups who could do the job. They might argue they do the job better. And there is this vote on Tuesday where you want to get your members on side. But if that's lost, is there a possibility that the CBI packs up after 6 decades?
Look, it's a really nerve-wracking time for us as an organisation, and I'm absolutely determined that we lead this programme of change so that we can be that collective voice. And of course, there are other business organisations, and we've worked really well with them in the past. We've collaborated with them. That's what we did during the pandemic. We worked with people to say, how do we have a furlough scheme that really works for business? We worked with the TUC on making that happen. The CBI, we have over 60 years of experience in economic surveys and analysis. And my question to politicians, to our members, is look, we have expertise. We have a whole programme of change that we're determined to work through on our culture.
And part of that programme of change is that you are losing a third of your staff to keep the costs down. Will you take a pay cut?
Look, we're looking at all the options, absolutely.
So and you will, are you?
And look, you know, my pay is already not as high as my predecessors. And I think what's really important is not is that we protect as many jobs as we can through this. That's really, I don't want to lose any colleagues. That's why I've come back. I've come back to fight for the organisation, to fight for the jobs and the people within that organisation. And I'm really determined to do it. But to do that, we need the backing of our members. And what we have set out is a whole programme of change so that we can show that we've got the right culture, that we're addressing any workplace misconduct, that people feel supported if they raise issues. And look, this is a problem across our society, right? So many organisations are grappling with this. I hope we can take some of the lessons and share those
well, let's
with
see
wider
what happens
society.
on Tuesday. I'm sure some of your members, maybe some of those who will be voting on Tuesday, will have heard what you had to say this morning. Thank you, all three of you, for now. And as Rain was saying, workplace culture is a huge issue, not least in Westminster, where again this week there has been allegations of inappropriate behaviour by a Labour MP, Geraint Davis, who's apologised if he caused anybody upset. Let's talk to Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, who joins us from Salford this morning. Now, we'll talk in a second about your plans for green jobs. We know that matters to you. But on that subject of bad behaviour in politics, did you know, as other MPs now say they do, that there were concerns about Geraint Davis' behaviour for some time?
Good morning. No, I didn't. As a member of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, have been involved in the changes that we have made to our disciplinary processes. We've overhauled them significantly, precisely to try and improve our response to allegations of this kind. I recognise there is always more to do, but we've clearly tried very, very hard to make sure we're doing everything we can as an organisation and taking swift action where allegations do emerge of completely unacceptable behaviour, to suspend MPs and then let this process take its course and investigate them properly and go through what should be the proper mechanisms to stamp out this kind of behaviour and hopefully change culture over the long term. And as I say, there's always more to do, but this is completely unacceptable to hear about allegations of this kind, and we're determined to face them down.
But the last time that you joined us, Jonathan Reynolds, you were very clear on this subject too, because it was only less than a month ago I had to ask you about an allegation of sexual assault against a Labour frontbencher. There was the case also of a Labour advisor who was found by two different processes to have behaved inappropriately towards women. Can you see why some of our viewers might think the Labour Party has a problem with this?
Well, those are all incredibly serious events, and I have always given you, I hope, candid answers about my personal revulsion about hearing stories of this kind and the need to make sure we're responding properly to them. I do think if you look at the Labour Party in the last few years where allegations are made against any colleague, the action taken is swift. The process has been fundamentally changed. I hope people have confidence in that and feel they can be supported properly when they need to come forward with allegations.
But do you think the party has a problem? Because you have made changes to the complaint system. That's true. It's being reviewed again, as I understand it. But do you think Labour has a particular problem with this?
I think there are clearly problems in politics, as there are in other fields, business, other sectors too. I think that the thing that we can say in the Labour Party is we're not complacent about it, and we have sought to make these changes. That's everything from how we, were failing to deal with problems around anti-Semitism to tackling allegations of this kind. It's required that comprehensive response across the board, and we're always going to seek to improve that, to make sure we're doing everything we can as an organisation to fulfil the standards that people quite rightly expect of us and we expect of ourselves.
Let's talk about green energy then. So we know that Labour wants to get all electricity production to be green by 2030 and also to end exploration of oil and gas in the North Sea. But one of your union backers this morning has said that Labour is naive and wrong on this, and you're risking tens of thousands of jobs in Scotland.
Well, first of all, net zero represents the biggest jobs opportunity for a generation. That's why it is so important to us. That's why we want this country to get the benefits from that. And we're blowing it at the minute, frankly, under the Conservatives. We are blowing the chance for what could be a transformational economic change that's positive for every part of the country.
But what about protecting jobs that already exist?
Specifically on oil and gas, Laura. We will see in the North Sea existing oil and gas fields continue to produce well up until 2050 for the 28,000 directly employed people in that sector. They'll continue to work in that sector. But the big opportunity comes from the transition, and we don't think further new oil and gas fields are the answer. First of all, because they won't do anything for bills, they won't do anything for our energy security, they cost a lot of public subsidy, they clearly be a climate disaster. But also, there are better alternatives available, and it's by embracing that change, our plans for public investment, for public stakes in things like gigafactories and the transition to green steel, for renewables, for storage, for nuclear, that is where the future future is. And of course, the number of jobs that will be created by that is far in excess of the jobs currently there. But as I say, those people will continue to work in that sector till 2050. And at the same time, the kind of jobs that are being created, the roles will be the same. They're jobs for electricians and engineers and surveyors and technicians and people who will be required in this new area. So we are trying to get the balance right. I think we are being proportional in it. We're looking at what is the biggest opportunity for the UK.
But if you're getting it right, why are you causing alarm in that sector? And can you be really clear on exactly what the policy would be? You wouldn't grant any new licences if you win the election, but you wouldn't stop any existing projects that were underway. Is that the position?
That is exactly the position. So we will not grant further licences, but we will not turn off our existing supplies or licences that have been granted before we form the Labour government that we want to create. And this is about the future, and the chance and the opportunity for the UK is enormous. There are particular competitive advantages that we've got as a country in things like offshore wind, in hydrogen, in what storage will mean. And we cannot protect bill payers or our energy security by remaining hooked on fossil fuels. The alternatives are better, they're cheaper, they're more compelling. And embracing this big opportunity is so important to the UK. And I understand, to be frank, in the past, under Conservative governments, big economic transitions in the UK have not been handled well. I mean, I grew up in the coalfields of County Durham. I represent East Manchester, Tameside here, where we had significant deindustrialisation in the past, and they weren't managed well.
Would you guarantee then, viewers in Scotland who work in the North Sea industry, that there will not be any job losses? Can you do that?
I can guarantee there'll be further job opportunities, more jobs created in the energy sector in Scotland from our plans. And that's true actually of every part of the UK, because the opportunities are massive.
But
and
that's
the innovation...
not the same as guaranteeing there won't be job losses, because if you're talking about a transition, many people, including in the Scottish Labour Party, where, let's remind our audience, you guys are pretty desperate to get some seats back in Scotland. There are people in Scottish Labour worried that you are actually causing alarm here and there could be a significant impact on people's jobs.
Well, look, the North Sea, regardless of our policy, is in long-term decline. It's not producing the same amount as it's done in the past. So there will be some specific changes to production in certain areas of the North Sea, but we will not be revoking existing production, and therefore people will not lose any jobs from working on an area that somehow has had the licence to extract taken away by a Labour government. This is about where we go in future and the opportunities of the future and seizing those. This is such a, look what the Biden administration has done in a short space of time in the US. Look at the scale of private investment it has attracted. You can move incredibly quickly on this. Look at the price of offshore wind, a third of the cost it was just 5 or 6 years ago in the UK. These opportunities are there when we embrace them, and ultimately this is about more and better jobs in the future and in the long term, and that is why it's so important to us.
And I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it in the next few months. As I've got you as Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, I'm not sure if you heard Rain talk about how she hopes the CBI can survive. Political parties had pressed pause on their cooperation with that business group. Would you work with them again?
Well, the allegations and the events at the CBI are clearly incredibly serious. They required a very substantial response. I think, listening to Rain, that is what the CBI is seeking to do. I'll be following the EGM next week extremely closely, but I would say I do think this country needs a significant national business voice that encompasses all of the different parts of the economy. There's some great business organisations for subsets of different sectors, but it needs, I think, an overall national voice, because I think one of the reasons the economy has fared so poorly in the last 13 years under the Conservatives has been the disrespect they've had in general for expertise and for that business voice, and the CBI has been able to challenge them at times on that because it's got the scale to do so. So clearly we're going to be following those events incredibly closely next week.
OK, Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just one of the many people who will be watching that closely on Tuesday. Now, we have talked a lot together about what's going on in Ukraine, but we should also talk about a different threat, the chances of a conflict between Taiwan and China. It feels, and it is, very far away. Taiwan's an island just 110 miles off the coast of China's mainland, and it has a population of more than 23 million. But in recent months, China has staged military exercises and mock strikes against the island and in its surrounding waters. So why are things more and more tense? Should we worry? I spoke to Taiwan's Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu.
The reason is very simple. It is the Chinese government, the communist government. They have an expansionist motivation. They've been trying to expand their sphere of influence And in the South China Sea, China is claiming the whole body of water and trying to send their military vessels and aircraft to patrol the region against the sovereignty claim of other countries. This is something that we need to watch out for because that caused the confrontation in between democracy on the one hand and authoritarianism on the other. People here are still living normally. The reason is because Taiwan has been under military threat for decades, even though it is becoming more serious. But the people decided not to be intimidated by China.
Minister, if someone hasn't been following this story, why should they care?
The tension is not only for Taiwan to face. The tension is probably going to affect the rest of the world. One simple fact is that around 50% of the goods to the rest of the world goes through the Taiwan Strait. And more seriously, Taiwan is a main producer of semiconductor computer chips. And about 60% of the total output of the semiconductor products are coming from Taiwan. So any interruption of the international supply chain is going to have a very serious impact upon the rest of the world.
But you've been doing drills to prepare the public for a possible invasion. Won't that just antagonize China?
We're trying to strengthen our defense capabilities so that China understands that it won't be able to use force against Taiwan and take Taiwan over easily. In fact, this is a long-term investment from the Taiwanese government. And we are also working together with like-minded countries like the United States to toughen up the training process to acquire the necessary weapons for our self-defense.
President Biden raised eyebrows when he said the US would defend you if there was an invasion. Do you believe that?
In order for Taiwan to be able to defend itself, we need the US assistance, and the United States has been helping Taiwan during this period of time. They are setting us the necessary weapons for Taiwan's self-defense. And at the same time, the United States is helping Taiwan to train our soldiers to be adaptive to the modern warfare. And that is highly appreciated. Just like the war in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have been bravely defending their own territory, their sovereignty, and their freedom. And it serves as an inspiration to the Taiwanese people. We understand that if China wants to launch an attack against Taiwan, we have the determination to defend ourselves. Whether the United States is coming to assist Taiwan in an event of war is still not a conclusion at this moment. But we have been stressing, and I'll need to stress again, that the defense of Taiwan is our own responsibilities.
Liz Truss visited Taiwan recently, but there were suggestions that increased tension. But would you actually like more visitors like that?
The Chinese government has been trying to exclude Taiwan from participating in major international organizations such as the UN, the WHO, Interpol, ICAO, and etc. So any kind of support for Taiwan to participate in those international organizations is highly appreciated. Former Prime Minister Liz Truss visited Taiwan, and she was highly welcomed by the government and the people here in Taiwan. And her physical presence in Taiwan shows her support for the Taiwanese endeavors, and that is highly appreciated. So we would like to invite more statesmen, more politicians, parliamentarians, or even government officials. We would like to welcome more people from the UK to visit Taiwan.
So would you like the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary to visit?
I understand that there's practical limitations on the foreign policy of the UK government, but whenever they feel convenient, I think the interactions from Taiwan side will be ready.
There's evidence that China is using misinformation online as a weapon against Taiwan. Are you worried about that?
Disinformation, misinformation, cognitive warfare, infiltration, all this type of hybrid warfare has been there in a very serious way in Taiwan. The Chinese have been using that to influence the cognitive of the Taiwanese people, and they try to shape the beliefs of the Taiwanese people, especially that the United States is not trustworthy.
What about artificial intelligence? Are you concerned that China might create deep fakes and spread images that are false?
That is something that the experts here are very concerned about. For example, in the election time, and by the way, the election, the democratic election, presidential and parliamentary election is coming up very soon. People are worrying about the Chinese possibility, the Chinese government will use those kinds of techniques, AI or artificial intelligence or deepfake, that kind of techniques to affect Taiwan's national election. But the experts and the government here are very alert to all kinds of possible manipulations by the Chinese government. So with that, I think Taiwanese government is probably more guarded than any other government in the world.
Minister Wu, thank you very much for your time. And we will keep an eye on that issue for you in the coming months. But it is nearly 10 o'clock, believe it or not. An hour ago, we were asking whether the government's really setting out immigration promises that it can keep. Here's Robert Jenrick.
We are taking very robust steps, and I think we have probably the most comprehensive plan of any of the major European countries, and we're already delivering.
And you have a... Well, you've been in touch. One of you said the government's just kicking the can down the road because they can resolve the issue. In a few years' time, it will be Labour's problem. That's what Ken Bradley told us. Another one. Why are we accepting asylum seekers in this country when they've travelled through many countries where they could ask for asylum? That's what Dave Crouch asks this morning. It's always great to hear what you think, so thank you for getting in touch. But as promised, for our finale on the programme, let's talk about your big finale, Brian. Now, you revealed that you haven't actually watched the finale of Succession.
No.
Why not?
I'm dead. Dead people don't watch things like that.
I feel I must apologise for anybody who either hasn't been watching or didn't know that that happened very early on in season 3. But why don't you watch it?
I don't know. I've never liked watching myself, for a start. And somehow or other, because of what happened to Logan, I've been disinclined to watch the rest. I knew how it was going to end, because I knew that Logan had already set it up. And so I gather that ultimately, in the end, Logan's won through, even though he's in the grave. But it's a strange situation. I mean, I don't cling on to things. You know, when I'm over, it's over, and I go on. You know, and I find that with this show, which has been a great show. It's been one of the great shows of all time, and especially for me, so I can't complain.
I mean, it's been a phenomenon, a huge phenomenon.
I know. I can't go anywhere without, you know. Anyway, people asking me for what was it somebody said? Oh, I can't remember what the euphemism for F off. Anyway.
We are a family show.
I know.
But I'm interested that you say Logan wins, basically. He was right. And without giving away the details of the ending, because I know neither of you have seen the last episode yet.
She hasn't seen the series.
Well, we'll ask her why in a second. How could you miss that?
She's got other things to do. She's quite busy, as you can see. Look, it's all there. She's a very busy woman. And I completely respect the fact that you haven't seen the series.
But without giving it all away, none of his children succeed the crown.
And they don't deserve to.
And they don't deserve to.
And I think that's the whole point of the show. I mean, the show's been heading that way, and it really is down to our genius writers and, you know, and Jesse, who steered it that way, that they had to, you know, because they have been living in this, and this is, you know, I did a show about, I did a thing for Channel 5 about the wealth gap, because that fascinates me, the fact that people are getting poorer and people are getting richer. And the rich are becoming so out of it. They're so separated. And that's what our show is dealing with. And rightly, they got their just desserts at the end. Apparently. I haven't seen the finale, but apparently they get their just desserts.
Rain, are there people in business who are really as bad as Logan Roy?
Well, look, see, this is where the honest confession is. I haven't seen it. I'm a working mum with 4 young girls. So we're partway through Race Around the World in Canada. So we're at episode 2. So,
okay, so family viewing.
We're into family viewing, but I've heard it's brilliant. It's on the bucket list. So when my husband and I have some time, we're going to watch, because I'm sure Brian
So in about 2028. Salma, have you been watching?
I got to the end of season 1 and then I had a baby, so I haven't caught up with it, but I am going to. So this is, even though it's annoying that you've all kind of like given away the plot lines, I am going to pursue.
Call it a tease.
Yeah,
it's going to be haven't given it all away. We've just given people a bit of a tease, although we did do the big reveal that Logan does die in the which is what you kept to yourself when you were on before the series.
I even had an obituary. They did an obituary for Logan, which they got quite wrong. They did an obituary in the Los Angeles Times.
My goodness. an obituary for a fictional character,
Exactly.
only in Los Angeles. All three of you, thank you so much for joining us. We could talk about that all day and the dastardly behaviour of the Roy clan, totally unlike the exemplary behaviour of my panel this morning. Thank you to them. And of course, thank you to you for watching on a morning when we've had a big conversation about immigration, a subject that the Conservatives want to put at the top of the political list, even though much of their record is one of broken promises and failure. Looking at the numbers now, it is wise to be sceptical about the chances of that much changing, but let us see. Right now, though, the government has question marks about its competence of the system and that contradiction built in, that the economy needs workers from overseas, and ministers have presided over a huge rise in the numbers, although they always say they want to bring it down. Maybe you don't get very far if you put your foot on the brake and your other one on the accelerator at the same time. Thank you for your company. As always, you can catch up on iPlayer, or I'll see you here at 9 next week. Goodbye.